Hi everyone, welcome to Watch It Play Table Talk Back. My name is Rodney Smith. In this episode, we're going to take a look at your responses to the question, can a game's theme go too far? Before we dive in, I just want to say a very quick thank you, because anytime I introduce a topic that I think might be a bit controversial, I worry because I try to keep this channel a very positive place for you to come and visit. And I worry that sometimes when you get controversy on the internet, it can very quickly turn into a rage machine. And you know what? Once again, you guys did not disappoint. A variety of different points of view were expressed, and they were done civilly and with great thought. I really appreciate that. Vexel Music says, taboos are human superstition. We could come up with any taboo we want, and it would be just as ridiculous as any other taboo that exists. There should be no theme that bothers us. All subjects deserve to be thought and talked about. Thinking and communicating are important activities for humanity. Vexel and a number of other people expressed this point of view that there's no game theme that would or should offend a player. And I feel like maybe a distinction needs to be made here, because Vexel, I agree with you. There's no subject that I would want banned from conversation, because I think that even highly controversial ones allow us to grow as humans, allow us to discover new points of view and even challenge our own, and that can be very valuable. But I think there's a little bit of a difference when we take that subject matter and we put it into our entertainment, and then we ask people, at least by extension, to reenact certain kinds of behavior. Because I have to imagine we all have certain activities that we wouldn't engage in because it would make us feel uncomfortable, because it's not who we are. It would go against our belief systems, whatever they might be. For example, I wouldn't push my grandmother down the stairs. Now, that's kind of a goofy example, but let me see if I can bridge the gap here a little bit. In the 1950s, there was a game that came with a pop gun and some targets, and you would shoot the targets, and the player who hit the most targets first would be the winner. The catch here was that the targets were African Americans, specifically African American children, and the game did not call them African Americans. So this is a game theme that, to my mind, was not trying to encourage social conversation. It was feeding off of the racism of the time and then capitalizing on that. And so for me, that kind of theme and that kind of game is too offensive. It's not something I would want to play. It's something I would want to discourage other people from playing, and I certainly wouldn't want to see someone making a profit off of it. And so I wonder if maybe that kind of example bridges the gap between what we're saying is offensive themes and themes that we would not want to encourage in games. Maybe not, though. I think we all have our own definitions of what's going too far, and some people's definition may be wider than others. Jason Smith says, Puerto Rico basically turned me into a serious gamer. It's still a favorite, but if I think too hard about its theme of exploitation, taking brown tokens off a ship, placing them in fields and buildings to work, for which I pay them no money, it's a big turnoff. Like most Euros, the theme is just barely there, so it can be easily ignored, and I can focus on the game's great design and gameplay, but I do respect people who choose not to play it. See, here we have a very popular game that has connections back to a historical time and place that kind of evokes, again, this idea of slavery, and then as players, we're using those slaves to achieve our ends. And so if you're against slavery, by definition, this theme kind of puts you in a difficult position. I've played Puerto Rico. I'm not trying to stir the pot over this game specifically, because I know a lot of people have played it. I would play it again for sure as well, but here we go. I just a few seconds ago was saying I would not play this game because it's got racial themes in it that would offend me, but this one I'm okay with. I don't know exactly what distinguishes one from the other. I think in part because, well, first of all, when I played Puerto Rico the first several times, it never even occurred to me that that's what this game was evoking. So I feel like you can play this game without ever feeling like you're being a slave owner. It's just worker placement, not slave placement. But if you look deeper, I think you can see those roots, and then you do have to decide for yourself. Can I separate myself enough from the theme of this game that I can feel comfortable with what I'm actually reenacting here? It's a challenging topic. I think it is. Count Blanc says, for me, it's less the theme, though this certainly can matter, and more how the game respects the theme. Archipelago is a game about Western colonization, and it pretty much treats it with as much gravity as if it were about happy puppies or brushing your teeth. This, to me, is an example of an offensive theme. That said, I've never actually been stopped from playing a game that has made me uncomfortable, but I think many people would be totally justified in doing exactly that. I have Archipelago, but I actually haven't played it myself. I haven't even learned it yet, so I can't speak to that theme specifically, but you raised an interesting point. It really got me thinking. Because there are certain themes that I would otherwise find offensive if the game was making light of it or encouraging it. But if the game's taking it seriously and treating it with sort of the level of respect that maybe the theme requires, I think that does make a difference. Leapfrog Ninja says, I'd like to point out Memoir 44. This is more harsh because it's based on real events. It's based on World War II, which stops you being transported to that imaginary world you mentioned. And I talked in the last Table Talk episode about how when I'm playing a game, I'm being transported to a fictional setting. It's a fictional world. It's not the real world, so that helps create that buffer so that even if the subject matter is quite serious, I'm not offended by it. You're right, Memoir 44 does take place in World War II, which is more realistic. Maybe I could have explained it better. Even in Memoir 44, I'm issuing orders with cards and dice. It doesn't, although it's based in the real world, I don't feel like I'm really recreating those exact moments and then trying to live them out myself. I think Super Cheese does a better job of explaining it. He says, I know a few people who'd be very offended by the game Tomorrow. That's the game we had on the table in the Table Talk episode. But for me, it's very difficult to sympathize with a bunch of different colored wooden doorknobs. And I think that's what I'm saying. It becomes even more of a fictional setting when the components that you're using become even more and more abstracted. I think if the components looked more realistic, then that might start to push the barrier on what would offend me and what wouldn't. JJ Bellew says, Kittens in a Blender. Talk about a really twisted game if you think about it. Kittens in a Blender, right here. All these cute, cuddly kittens, and the whole object is to try to get your opponent's kittens into the blender where they get shredded and chewed up and destroyed. Yes, again, this is one that is offensive if you think about it too much, but they even talk about it in the instructions. They're trying to be light and silly, and I think that's why it gets beneath people's radar in terms of offensiveness, but I would totally appreciate if someone says, I don't want to play a game where the object is to stick kittens in a blender. Kevin Erskine says, a game is just a game in my books, so if I was playing alone, then no issue. Playing with others can be a different issue, but that's their problem, not mine. Yeah, I kind of agree with you in the sense that I want to be able to say, hey, this game doesn't offend me, and if you're offended, that's not my problem. At the same time, games are a social thing, so when I'm sitting down to a table to play with other people, I want other people to be enjoying their experience, and there are hundreds of games out there, so I am probably going to avoid a game that I think has a theme that's going to make someone else at the table uncomfortable. I imagine probably most of us, including yourself, would feel that way too, but I appreciate your point in saying that, listen, if I find the theme comfortable, I'm not going to change my point of view just because you find it uncomfortable. Sidrock says, the theme of the games don't matter, of course, respecting the age target of the game. This is something else I didn't touch on, but yeah, there are certain games that might have a certain amount of gratuitous violence or sexual themes that I just wouldn't want to play with Luke because I'd feel like it's over his head, not appropriate for his age group. Not to mention that if your children are very small, there just may be some safety things you need to consider, like them choking on a meatball. Norm Nevin says, the language and graphics are a factor. If they're too rough, I'm out. I stayed away from Spartacus because of its R rating. What offends us, what is acceptable, what isn't always easy to pin down, but I have to agree with you. I think sometimes when the theme is presented to us, when we're talking about not the ideas of the game, but just the presentation of it, the artwork, sometimes that's a little easier to pin down. There certainly are some games that, because of the depictions in them, it would make me uncomfortable to play them, certainly with my grandmother. So that might be an area that a game might offend us. Now, I said I would try to give a couple of examples of games that personally offended me. Wrath of Kings was a recent Kickstarter that wrapped very successfully. I had a chance to try it at Gen Con. The gameplay seemed very cool. The miniatures were gorgeous. But in almost every faction, the female characters were pretty much half-dressed. This is a game about factions warring constantly. I could not find a functional purpose where you wouldn't want to be wearing something up here besides pasties. So for me, bringing this home, I play most of my games with my children. So to me, this is a game theme that just didn't fly for me. If my son was older, maybe then. But even still, I was pushing the limits of what I was comfortable with. Another game, Consuming Goddess, is a deck building game, which I understand has actually really cool and clever mechanics. again, the depiction of the artwork, both male and female, feels more sexually charged than functional, and that makes me a bit uncomfortable. And even if I saw past it, I would be uncomfortable bringing it out in mixed company because I could see other people being uncomfortable around the table, and I don't want to create that situation if I can avoid it. I had a very difficult time finding a game where the ideology itself was what offended me. Maybe that's because I haven't played enough games yet. Actually, I just thought of one. There was one I mentioned on the Secret Cabal Gaming podcast when I was there as a guest. Ghettopoly was on Kickstarter. I think this was released at one point in time where you're playing as a pimp. Yes, that game probably I would never want to play, not just because it looked stupid and it was poor production, but the theme itself, I don't know if it offends me directly, but I don't see any need to be playing that kind of theme. Alright, so there's one kind of example. I really appreciate you guys engaging me in this conversation. It can be a little difficult one to navigate. I also hope I didn't misquote or misrepresent anybody. I recognize that YouTube doesn't give you a lot of room to fully express your opinion, so I really just use these comments as a jumping off point for me to talk further about it and hopefully engage you in it a little further. I do not think the people I quoted that I have a full concept of what their point of view is around this topic, and I hope that you guys don't think that you do either based on my little fragment of what I've presented here from their feedback. I want to leave you now with a couple clips from the video responses. Until the next episode, thanks for watching.
Cooper here. I really like this question. It's very thought-provoking, and which ironically is how I like my themes thought-provoking. I personally haven't come across a game that tests my moral compass because I would play any game. However, I won't buy every game, even if I like it, because I utilize theme to teach games. So when I'm teaching someone, if I'm teaching them, an example would be Underground Railroad, I can't continue to drive on that theme to teach someone. I just get uncomfortable. I have no problem being taught it. I have no problem playing it. Another one would be Manhattan Project. You never know who you're going to offend, and there's another game that came up. It was talked about that it was conveying that building bombs and bombing people is not a message you should send to kids or whatever. And I thought that's kind of ridiculous because of all the games we play where you're doing something that's completely wrong, like any war game ever, and then you have these fantasy games that take you someplace else and you're still doing horrific deeds or conquering people. What I think that is the trigger is if the theme puts you in that specific era, time, or place where there was so much negativity or so many bad things happens that it's inescapable. Example being Holocaust. If you brought up Holocaust, it's so easy for someone to imagine that. It's so easy that once they're in that setting, regardless of what the game mechanics are, it's the Holocaust. The Underground Railroad, regardless of the game mechanics, it's slavery. Manhattan Project, regardless, those are actual events that occurred that now you're putting people in that time frame.